I'm Sebastian Musgrave, and this is Victoria's Legacy. Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Thank you for taking the time to be with us tonight.
That's no problem.
Now, sir, last year the Liberal Party effectively went out of office.
Yes.
They were overtaken by the Tories.
Yes.
How does it feel to be in opposition?
Well, it's very difficult because for me personally, I would stress that I held on to my seat of Caernarvon Burroughs with an increased majority. But the party itself was quite divided going into that election. And what we tended to find was a lot of the party was splitting down different lines. So for me personally and for some of my peers, it was a very good election and was something we were looking forward to. But unfortunately, with the party being divided between two wings, we were bound to lose that election. And that was always going to be our problem going into that.
And so what effect did this have upon you personally?
Upon me personally, it is to be out of office is not good, because I came into Parliament to make a change for people's lives and their livelihoods. So on a national level, it is not a good thing. But on a local and a personal level, I want to increase the power of the Liberal Party in opposition, hold the government to account on their promises that they've made in the election, and then hopefully next time round we will have a go and we will have a manifesto that we can deliver change for the country at large.
And do you believe, sir, that your constituency in Caernarvon Burroughs believes wholeheartedly in your aims?
Yes, I think they do. I'm a simple man. I was born and brought up in a very small cottage. My family was very, very close to me, and representing my area where I grew up has always been something that I've been extremely passionate about. And going with their challenges that they have in the area of land ownership, the problems that they've had with the establishment in our area, it is something that I've always wanted to champion, and I have been doing that since I was elected to be a Member of Parliament.
And that was
in 1890.
1890.
In a by-election.
Really?
Yes, a by-election. Unfortunately, the old Tory member passed away, so there was an opportunity for me, as the Liberal candidate, to take on the establishment, which is what I did. And what was more amazing about that election is I actually defeated the one person who I'd even seen in my childhood, Sir Hugh Ellis Nanny.
Do tell us,
Well,
sir.
the story of that is quite remarkable. You see, when I was a little boy in the school in Llanystimdwy, which is a very small village near Criccieth, near Porthmadog, in that area, every year the local landowner, who was the squire of Llanystimdwy, was Sir Hugh Ellis Nanny. And he used to come and he used to stand there with the priest in the schoolroom, and we all had to stand up and recite the creed. Now, bearing in mind that this was a Church of England school, that everybody in the school was from the nonconformist Baptist religion. So we had to stand up and recite the creed. So one of my first little rebellions that I did when I was a small boy was to encourage my classmates not to recite the creed and resist. And the person that I did that to was Sir Hugh Ellis Nanny. So all those years later, when I ran in the by-election, it was against the very man who I'd stood up to as a little boy. So you can imagine, on the day of the election, I was hoping and praying that the local constituents would support me in that, against my long avowed, not an enemy, but a person who I had always wanted to take on and defeat. And I did.
Extraordinary, sir.
Yes.
A very interesting story.
Yes.
What is Sir Hugh doing these days?
Sir Hugh, I believe he's still sitting in his palace, counting his money, as all these landowners do. You see, they do not represent, in my view, the local community. They don't have their interests at heart. Whereas myself and the Liberal Party, we need to change. And the reason for that election defeat last year is we, in my view, were not radical enough. And this Liberal Party has to be radical to change the working man, to change the conditions that they live in.
Yes, I can see that. And certainly there's a growing movement in that regard at the moment in the country. You have members of Parliament such as Mr. Keir Hardie, for instance, who I know is active in that very event. Now, sir, you are a very famous proponent of Home Rule for Wales. Mm-hmm. To what extent have you been successful in that aim?
I think, for my own personal view, it has always been something that I've believed in. We founded a movement called Cymru Fydd, which means Young Wales, Wales of the future. Very, very similar to what happened in Ireland, where they have been looking for Home Rule. I believed, and certain colleagues of mine believed, that Home Rule for Wales should always be on our top of our agenda. Because Wales is a different country to England, and it is different to Ireland, and it is different to Scotland. So we always believed that we could have a base in the country that we could make everybody feel valued and feel part of the community, and not to be ruled by the Anglican Church, for instance, which is why we wanted to push the disestablishment of the Church in Wales, to make it that we would be on our own. So I'm not a separatist. I would stress that, because a lot of people in the party have accused me of being a separatist, that I want to split Wales away from the United Kingdom. I want to stress to you now that I don't want that. And the Cymru Fydd movement believes in keeping Wales part of the United Kingdom, but having its own self-governance, so it is able to look after its own affairs.
Self-governance?
Yes.
So, sir, what does this mean in practice for the relationship between Westminster and Wales?
I think in practice what it does mean is the Welsh MPs would look after their own affairs. They would be able to look after all their education, all the care that they need in the community, the workhouses, the poor, and have the country at the forefront of what they need to do, not to be ruled by Westminster. I mean, I am an MP for Westminster, and I am proud to support my constituency, but I think, wouldn't it be good to have Wales as a separate parliament, but also part of the United Kingdom?
And is that, sir, the wish of the Welsh people?
That is a very interesting point. The challenge that I did have in the party was a lot of my colleagues, Lord Rosebery, for instance, and William Harcourt, they were against my policy for Home Rule, and I ended up going down to South Wales to try and persuade my Liberal colleagues, and unfortunately it didn't work out. They didn't want to be behind me. So in a sense, the Cymru Fydd movement, while alive, and I believe quite strong, unfortunately at this day and age I cannot see Home Rule in the next forthcoming 10 to 20 years.
What, sir, is your opinion then on the Irish movement towards Home Rule?
I believe the Irish movement is closer than at any point in my lifetime to having Home Rule for Ireland. That has long been the goal of the Liberal Party for a long time. We know that Irish Home Rule will solve all the problems over there and make that country a strong country, which is what it used to be. And this party has fallen time after time on Irish Home Rule, but we will get there in the end.
And let us hope so, sir. A very honourable aspiration, if I may say. I do have some sympathy for those aims. Now, sir, you have been known to be a dogged proponent and absolutely determined in your plight for the increase of the conditions, or rather the improvement of the conditions for the working man.
Yes.
Would you set out for us the way in which you propose to achieve your aims, and indeed what those very aims are?
I think that's a very important point, and a lot of the new intake of the last 5 to 6 years of the Liberal Party has firmly believed in changing people's lives for the better. When you grow up in a community, as I did, and you see old people having no money at all to support them, they are relying on the savings that they have made, eking their lives out time after time, and then when they're at an age where they cannot work, there is no support for them. It's the same when somebody gets ill or sick. We expect them to work, but there is nothing there to back them up and to help them out in their hour of need. So, as I mentioned to you earlier, we and my colleagues in the Liberal Party, the modernisers in the Liberal Party, are strongly pushing for the next manifesto that we have when we go into the election, to have a plan to support people in their old age, to support people when they are ill. Now, the biggest question that the Conservative and Tory party as a whole always ask the Liberal Party is, how are we going to pay for this?
Indeed.
Now that is the biggest challenge. But I have been reading lots of works recently. The works of Sidney Webb, for instance, who is a member of the Fabian Society, and you touched on, you mentioned a good friend of mine, Mr. Keir Hardie, who, again, very similar to myself, very similar background. I do hope one day he will join the Liberal Party, but I know he has some ideas of himself in terms of setting up another party. But I do hope and pray that together we can change this country for the better. We are at the dawn of a new century. We're only 4 years from the year 1900. What country do we want to live in? And that is one thing that myself and my younger colleagues in the Liberal Party are pushing forward. I'm afraid to say, and I have to say this, that the days of Lord Rosebery and the days of Gladstone sitting there and the humdrum liberalism that I have been seeing has to end, and we have to be bolder and much more ambitious.
Some might say, sir, that is a very, well, as you've indicated, bold and ambitious aspiration. What regard would the Tory supporters give such an aspiration, and how would you overcome any perceived obstacle in that avenue?
I would always imagine that the Tory party would oppose any legislation that we would put down. We would expect them to. They would be in opposition, so we would expect them to oppose it. But, and I do have to say this, there are some people in the Conservative Party who are starting to move down the line of believing that their way of answering the questions that in this country today is to look at some of these things. So I do believe we can reach out the hand of friendship to some members in the Tory party to bring them round. The challenge of the House of Lords will always be a challenge, but that is another battle we may need to face.
Yes, and I see that we've had a great insight into your personality and your political aims, and I wish you all the best of fortune for these aspirations.
Thank you.
But what of them? I mean, from whence did they come? I believe that in your childhood you had similar aspirations towards rebelliousness, towards agitation. In fact, I believe your uncle had a picture of the late President Abraham Lincoln.
Yes,
Is that so?
Yes, he did. My uncle was everything to me. You have to remember that I never knew my father. My father was a school teacher. He travelled round the country. He was a school teacher in Lancashire, and then he ended up as a school teacher in Manchester. He didn't like it. He always wanted to be home in Wales. And in fact, a lot of people don't know that I was actually born in Manchester. And a lot of people do not know that after I was born, my father left the schoolroom in Manchester, travelled back to Wales, and then very, very sad, he caught pneumonia and he passed away.
I'm sorry, sir.
We were brought up by my mother. My mother's brother was somebody called Richard Lloyd. Now, that man was the local cobbler in Llanystumdwy village where I ended up living. And we lived in the house, it was called Highgate, all in this small cottage house, and attached to the house was the cobbler's workshop where he lived. He lived with us, and then one of the most amazing things about my uncle, he's still alive, he still gives me advice even to this day, and I hope he continues to do so. But he had a picture of Abraham Lincoln, and when I was a little boy, he said to me, that man was a small town solicitor, and he ended up being president of the United States of America. That inspired me. So I saw that picture. It still stands on the fireplace today as an inspiration to me and to my brothers. But what also my uncle did, he had books. He taught me. He taught me the history of the world. He taught me grammar. And the most important thing he taught me, he brought me into the local blacksmiths. Now, our little blacksmiths in Llanystumdwy is an amazing place. We have every person from the village, and we have a little debate. So every time we were small, we would have these debates.
Really?
And my uncle would run the debates. And that is where I started to have the passion for debating, the passion for trying to change people's lives, and the passion for encouraging other people to get on in life. Why should a small boy from a country village just be satisfied with working on the farm, collecting the milk, when he can, like me, become a solicitor, train, and then eventually become a representative for his area? Now, my uncle inspired me, and he inspired many others in the village to do that. But he was the biggest inspiration to me when I was a small child. I could not have got anywhere without him.
What then, sir, were your uncle's political leanings?
I don't think he really had any. If you asked him, he was definitely a liberal at heart, but I don't think he was specifically supported a party. He was very, very strong, non-conformist background, anti-establishment, anti the local squire, anti having the church ruling the school where it was. He was very much a man and power, and still is, of his time, of independence, of getting on in life, but also remembering our fellow people. That is the culture he has inspired me.
Is he still pursuing the occupation of the cobbler?
He is amazingly still working as a cobbler. A very good one as well. If you ever need a pair of shoes and you're passing through, I recommend you pop in and see him. But he's certainly a character, and he's certainly the one person who I rely on even now for advice. I go to him. He is like my father.
Now, sir, you mentioned a little earlier about Abraham Lincoln,
Yeah.
and the fact that he had his own law practice very famously. Now, you yourself had a very successful law practice. I believe you have offices both in Wales and here in London. How do you manage to manage the competing priorities of a career in law and that of politics?
It was actually my head teacher who got me into law. I used to sit close to the teacher. So it was my uncle, and the teacher inspired me to get into law. And what he said to me is, you, David, can be the person that you need locally to stand up for people's rights. And being a solicitor and training to be a solicitor allowed me to understand the law, especially around land. Land is the key to everything.
Really?
Who owns the land? Who has the rights to the land? And that is something that got me into law.
Of course, that's the Tories.
Absolutely. But you've got to understand that most of the land, especially in an area of North Wales, is owned by one person, and they have thousands of acres.
The squire?
A squire. A local person does not have any access to that, and he has to pay the rent to that man in the castle, the man in the mansion. And what does he get for it? He doesn't get anything for it. If he doesn't pay his rent, he is thrown off the land. So as a solicitor, what my aim was is to try and make the lives of the local people better. And I did that. I did that very successfully. In fact, there was a famous case where a man wanted to bury his father in a church. And there was no way the Anglican priest would let him. He said, I will not have any nonconformist people buried in my churchyard. So this man came to me in my office in Criccieth, where I was a solicitor, with my brother, who still runs the practice today. And he says to me, how on earth can I bury my father when this man will not let me go into a churchyard and bury him? I helped this man out. I looked at the law. The law said he was quite entitled to be buried in that land. So I had told him, go to the church, go to the priest, and break the lock on the gate, go in and bury your father. Like you should, you're quite entitled to do that.
And did he do it?
He did. He did. The vicar was not impressed. He came out and he said, that is against the law, and he took it to the court. The High Court originally ruled in his favour, in the church's favour. So I took on the High Court, and I took it all the way to the House of Lords, and eventually the House of Lords agreed with me that what that man did was perfectly within the law, and it was overturned, and everyone now to this day can be buried where they wish to be buried.
So then
now, isn't that a biggest thing you can achieve as a solicitor?
Well, quite certainly, sir. It is a rather magnificent achievement. And this, you say, inspired you in your law career?
Yes, it did. After that, I was very interested in getting into politics, you see. And that case possibly propelled me, in some senses, in the Liberal Party, that they could identify somebody who would stand up for their values.
I see, yes. Now, sir, I'd like to move to more contemporaneous issues. For instance, rather seriously, we know that this country may be on the brink of war in South Africa.
Yes.
What, sir, are your opinions on this situation?
I'm bitterly opposed to war in all its forms. War achieves nothing. It is only the despair of people on the sacrifices that they make, and it is the working man and the working family who always suffer when there's a war. The problem in South Africa has been caused by the Conservative government, letting the Boers allow themselves to be in a position when they can start to challenge the empire, and we have allowed that to happen. So the war is, in a sense, seems inevitable, but I'm bitterly opposed to it, and this government needs to step up to the plate and understand those issues and try and get a peaceful resolution to the quarrels and the problems that are forthcoming down the road. Because I do fear, I really do fear, in this age, in 1896, we have these vast empires. We have Britain, the biggest empire in the world. We have Germany, an upstart country that is trying to get an empire. We have France. We have these big powers, Russia, the geopolitical world, and the challenges that it faces can be very, very dangerous. And a small war in South Africa can lead to bigger things.
But surely, sir, war is inevitable in some situations.
No, war is never, ever inevitable. Never. Because you can always negotiate, you can always talk to the other side, you must never accept that war is inevitable. Never.
But, sir, you must see that may be interpreted as a rather weak, pacifistic attitude by some.
I don't really understand the word sort of you are saying to me if I was a pacifist or any way, shape or form. I am proud of this country, sir. Extremely proud. And I'm extremely proud of the people in this country.
But you wouldn't go to war.
I'm not saying this country may never come to war. But what this country needs to do is to stand up for its interests, but also make sure that the peaceful interests of this country and Europe in general are held in the highest regard, not to be swayed by what would we say, jingoistic views that the press can sometimes maintain, and the rush to war is always dangerous. Just remember, sir, look at what the damages war has caused to this country. Even in the last 20 or 30 years, we have had the debacles in Afghanistan. We lost the first Afghan war. We narrowly went in the second Afghan war. And we have lost thousands of men. And for what? For nothing. When we realise, as a country, we cannot be going into these wars. We can look after the people we govern. And I'm a big, proud statesman, and I will always be proud of that. But we can't be engineering wars for the sake of it, for the sake of building an empire further and further away. It is not going to be sustainable in the long term.
Yes, I see, sir, and I respect completely your views and the views of the Liberal Party, of course. And thank you for articulating them so vividly for us this evening. Now, sir, what of the future, both for you and for the Liberal Party? You've been quite eloquent, for instance, in telling us of your aims for the plight of the working man and your regard for the land owners.
Yes.
What does the future hold?
The future can be bright. It was a terrible defeat last year. To be losing that amount of seats this time in an electoral cycle is not good. But, as I've said earlier, the days of humdrum liberalism, middle of the road, are over. Now, Mr. Rosebery is still our leader, but I believe, sir, that is going to change. And I believe we have some other people in our party, Mr. Asquith, for instance, who believes in some of the values that I believe. And we have an even better person, Mr. Campbell Bannerman, who, in my view, a very, very eloquent Scotsman. I don't know if you've met him, but he is one of the best advocates of the social reform agenda that I have seen in the House of Commons.
So I've heard, sir.
Yes. Now, I would be delighted to serve with him in any future government. So for me personally, yes, I want to get into government, because it's only in government that you can change people's lives. And that's got to be our biggest aim as we move forward into a new century, sir.
Might one day we see Mr. David Lloyd George as Prime Minister?
I hardly think so, sir. Can you ever imagine the day when a person who was born in a small house in Manchester, in relative poverty, and then ended up being brought up in a tiny village, brought up by a cobbler, brought up by somebody who ran a local debating society, who didn't go to high school, who didn't go to university? Can you imagine a person of that in this country as Prime Minister? I, for one, cannot see that. But I do hope that the age of enlightenment is upon us, sir, and that one day, one of us who was born in a cottage can reach the heights of Prime Minister of this great country.
Mr. David Lloyd George, I thank you sincerely for your participation in this series outlining Victoria's legacy.